Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping our multivocal literary tradition a vital part of the culture. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. 2022 is Library of America's 40th anniversary year, which we're marking and celebrating with events like this one. Please check our website, loa.org, for updates. Tonight's program explores Hannah Arendt's incisive and remarkably timely essays on lying and politics, gathered in this Library of America special publication with an introduction by David Bromwich, who joins us tonight. A link to the book will be dropped in the chat shortly. Special thanks to our promotional partners for this program, the American Historical Association, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, Carnegie Council on International Ethics, the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and the National Council on History Education. Truthfulness has never been counted one of the political virtues, Hannah Arendt writes. So how does truth survive? And why does it seem especially fragile right now? How can the basic facts about our past and present be found and preserved, facts on which our freedom depends? And how much organized lying can a democracy withstand? To explore these questions, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by three distinguished guests. Seyla Benhabib is Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emerita at Yale University and Senior Research Fellow and Adjunct Professor of Law at Columbia University. Her many books include The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt and, as editor, Politics in Dark Times, Encounters with Hannah Arendt. Roger Berkowitz is Professor of Political Studies and Human Rights and Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. He joins us from Bard College in Annandale. David Bromwich is Sterling Professor of English at Yale University. His books include How Words Make Things Happen and American Breakdown, The Trump Years and How They Befell Us. His writing on contemporary politics and the fate of civil liberties in the United States has appeared in The Nation, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and elsewhere. He joins us from New Haven. The panel invites your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. Now, please welcome our moderator, Roger Berkowitz.
Thank you very much, Max, and welcome everybody. Hello to David and hello to Seyla. It's nice to see you both. I thought I'd begin by asking David why in 2023 or 2023, this book, 2022, this book is timely. As we all know, Hannah Arendt says truth has seldom been a political virtue. She wrote a lot about it in the 1940s and 1950s with regard to the attack on truth in both Nazi Germany and also in Soviet Bolshevik Russia. She wrote a lot about it in the 1960s in regards to the Vietnam War and other aspects of American attacks on truth. But she also wrote about it in regard to her own life with those who attacked her around her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And so this has been a long-standing problem. It's not new, certainly in our present day. And yet, obviously, in the last 5 to 6 years, these essays that you've brought out together, Lying in Politics and Truth in Politics, have become touchstones in our political debate, David. So I'm wondering what made you think that now was the right time to bring these out, and why did you do so?
Well, to begin with, and with appreciation, I should make the you, the we that did it, plural. It certainly includes Max Rudin and John Kulka of the Library of America. And it was John who wrote to me and asked me to write an introduction to these two essays. But it does seem to me that they are remarkable in themselves and timely, almost as if they were aimed at the moment we're living in now. The proliferation of not just untruths, but conscious lies, and something more peculiar and late coming. That is to say, Arendt wasn't alive to observe what we're seeing now, I think is the availability and the attractiveness of, let's call it, alternative stories, things that it suits me to believe. And there's a whole network of people whom I can communicate with and whom I can listen to give versions of this story, all consistent with something which has some overlap with reality that I can test. But if I were better informed, I might be able to see is false in a great many particulars, and therefore false in the total drift of what it's trying to persuade me of. I mean, this comes from social media, but it also comes from, I think, the more and more zealous commitment that people on different sides in American politics have to making their narrative prevail. And I think the weight that's given, or rather the very frequent and careless use that's given to that word narrative, is itself a clue to the fictionalization of desirable stories. Arendt was alert to this, and would have been in particular through having experienced the transition from the Weimar Republic to Nazi Germany. And I wouldn't want to exaggerate the comparisons some people have made between fascism, between the wars in Europe, and anything we're undergoing now. Those comparisons are hyperbolic, demagogic, and ignorant, and they are sometimes put forward by people who know much better. But it does seem to me that, if you just take as an example, claims that have been made about the 2020 election. You have now, and I'll stipulate as a truth, that the majority of the electoral votes, as well as the popular votes, on all the evidence we have that is in any way reliable, was won by President Biden, then candidate Biden, and that there's no substantial grounds for controversy over that. But somewhere between 35 and in the low 40% of the American people have grave doubts about that. Fully half, I think, of the minority party in the country now have doubts about it. And their doubts are based on stories that have been planted in the alternative media and in some of the major media, stories about computer hacking, the harvesting of absentee ballots, and just straightforward crookedness and corruption that are attributed to media and to state legislatures. But this claim about an election and the transition of power from one administration to the next is a very necessary feature of democracy if democracy is to be maintained. This claim is not absolutely new. It came out with surprising force and persistence in 2016 from the other side. Hillary Clinton said at least a dozen, maybe 24 times, that the election was stolen, that she was the real winner, and she was the winner of the popular vote. But her belief was that the election was determined by Russian hacking and Russian ads that were placed in certain accessible and highly influential outlets. There's no evidence to support that. And this was relatively new in American experience, that you would have two in a row such claims being made. The second, of course, much graver, because it led to an actual semi-organized attempt to stop the transition of power. But I mean, such is the evidence for untruth or lying of a consistency that makes itself believed. In our time, that I think Arendt would find both, a kind of offspring of the lies she saw in the reporting on the Vietnam War and in the public statements on it, but also a change in degree so great that it becomes a change in kind.
Thank you. Seyla, there's one of the few things in what David said that I'd love to hear you reflect on. One is the claim that he made, which is that this is indebted to, but quite different from the kind of lies that were told in the totalitarian periods. That this is not, and I think one of the reasons for that, as David I think actually brought out later, is that it's happening on all sides. It's not one central government attempting to lie and push those lies out. It's many different groups. There seems to be a multiplication of defactualizations going on at one time, not a totalitarianism, but many different simultaneous rejections of a consistent factual truth or a public truth or a common truth, and people being happy with their own truths in different groups. The idea that there's lots of different truths today. And somehow what's being lost in that is something called the common or the public or factual truth. What does it mean for a democracy to be in a position, maybe not of fascism and totalitarianism, but where there is no common agreement on factual truth? Is that something we should be worried about?
Yes, certainly we should be worried about it. I think I want to begin by making the observation that partisanship in politics is not new. Partisanship and parties, factions are the essence of the political. I mean, people used to read different newspapers or cheer for different soccer groups or whatever, and so I think that we have to see that there are always passions and partisanship that are part of the political process. But certainly what we seem to be experiencing at the present, and what makes us want to go back to events in the mid-century is quite unusual. And I want to focus on this term, defactualization. It's a term that Arendt associated with, on the one hand, the big lie of National Socialism. Sometimes even National Socialist bureaucrats themselves in the higher echelons knew that they were lying, that what they were doing was propaganda, that the Jews were not the root of all evil, that, but they carried on the defactualization nonetheless. And then, of course, in the period of Soviet communism, we have the actual struggle for power, where people like Trotsky are factually erased to photographs that they were first placed in. We are living in a period where I think it's true the availability of technology has created this hall of mirrors, and one doesn't quite know, where to go. The printed press has lost its authority. That's not a minor factor. And one can go into one's echo chamber. I mean, we all do this, and it's in some ways inevitable. How many newspaper websites do you look at in the morning? I look at about 3 or 4. Okay, I've made up my mind. But nevertheless, nevertheless, you know, and I think it is about journalism and also the transformation of the media right now that has made it more possible to carry partisanship to such a point that what David talks about narratives is not only just alternative narratives, it's almost as if we have come into a process of alternative reality. And that is what is so dangerous. Now, let me just add that I personally believe that there are much deeper socioeconomic forces that are causing the current, that are accounting for the current moment. I don't want just to focus on the transformations of the media, transformations of the public sphere. There is some much more serious questions of redistribution to above and increasing inequality. And these are proven. I mean, these are not just about this. There shouldn't be debates. The statistics are there. And as a result of this, there is also, I think, maybe, I don't know if just as a result of this, but there is also increasing cynicism towards the work of government. And here, one other consideration of Arendt may help us, and this comes from the origins of totalitarianism, which she talks about as the alliance of the mob and the elite. I mean, I personally am stunned by how much political nihilism there seems to be. Nothing seems to make a difference. If Trump does not pay his taxes, if he lies, if he cheats, if he denounces, I'm just like, nothing seems to make a difference. And this kind of collusion of a kind of political nihilism bordering on criminality, this is something that she talked about in the origins of totalitarianism. And this seems to me to be an astonishing moment, and not just a feature of technology.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you've hit on something really important, which is this idea of nihilism or deep cynicism of the elite that she talks about way back in Origins of Totalitarianism, but also throughout her work. And what allows them to say, well, look, the world, nothing matters. The world is corrupt. Maybe it's best to tear it all down. And that is what allows the elite to ally itself with the mob, as you said. The question that raises is, what's the alternative? Where is truth, right? If nihilism is the idea that there is no highest truth or no highest values, part of the problem is that the age we're in, which Arendt certainly believed, is that, well, there may be truths in reason or in other areas, there are no truths in politics. We live in a world in which there isn't truth. And so part of the problem we're having right now is, as technology emerges, people are able to point out the lacunae in any authority, the parts they leave out, and it's harder for any truth to become a public truth or establish itself. We can talk about lying and we talk about defactualization, and we are and we will, but what's the alternative? What does it mean to establish a truth today? Whether it's the truth of the fact that Biden won the 2020 election, or that Trump won the 2016 election, or the truth that the earth is warming for particular reasons. What does it mean to talk about a political truth? Aren't they just opinions, or how do we make that distinction? I'll let David maybe start, and Seyla can jump in if she'd like.
Yeah, I'll just refer to an interesting sentence in the longer of the two essays that this book reprints, the one on truth in politics. And she says there that truth carries within itself an element of coercion. That's not an intuitively comprehensible statement, but she means that the truth is, well, I'll paraphrase her by using a statement from William Godwin's book, Political Justice, from a couple of centuries earlier, the late 18th century. Godwin believed that, and he was a high Enlightenment idealist, the truth is something that cannot be conveyed so as to be understood and not be believed. It has that kind of compelling force. And this is what we have felt for a long time about science, about certain recommendations that come from medical authorities and so on. But politics is a little different. Politics in a democracy really is a matter of choice. It is a kind of knowledge, so you can call it science if you want, very loosely, but it ain't rocket science. And opinion is very much part of what politics is embodied by. So, you know, when people go to one elite or the other, and I would point out that our cultural elite is overwhelmingly anti-Trump, and it's a very widespread cultural elite of the educated and of the rich. The Democrats are now the party of the rich, unquestionably. So, you know, there's that problem too. Where do you go to find even your index to facts? When I was having trouble finding information about the summer 2020 riots, and I couldn't find much in Google, I went to an outlet that is smaller, and this is not meant to be an advertisement for them, but DuckDuckGo. Well, DuckDuckGo has nowhere near the encyclopedic comprehensiveness of Google. But on current things, it has the advantage that it doesn't track you, and it doesn't give back more of what you gave in. It doesn't give you what you asked for before. I was also, I mean, I found appealing the fact that that's an outlet that is advertised on NPR and on Fox. So, you know, there's some claim to eclecticism. Well, I mean, so if you have time, and as an academic, I do have some time, you can explore the options, and you can find, for example, that you trust more stories that give you the text of the thing they're supposed to refer to, that give you actual documents. And this is possible online. But, you know, if you're new to politics, or if you're zealous, or if you're heated by, you know, passions that are very strong because of people you know, because of people you distrust, I think you stick with the so-called authority that you believe in most. And, you know, here's where I think the tendency to censorship, which again, we're seeing on more than one political side, is a very grave danger to democracy. Arendt says in an interesting passage on authority, I think it comes up in this essay on truth in politics, that authority in the nature of it is in abeyance if you have to use persuasion to prove your authority. And authority fails utterly when it tries to use force to establish its truth, its reality. And we're seeing a great deal of, you know, frantic, heated attempts at persuasion, very fast reactions with, you know, fast agreements, and a fair amount of, you know, borderline use of force too. Again, January 6th comes to mind, but it's not the only event like that. There have been academic disruptions of speakers who are felt to be unfriendly to the politics of the crowd, even at Yale Law School recently. I mean, you know, places where you would have thought, you know, part of the covenant of the profession these people are involved in is not to shout down a speaker. But these things are interconnected. They have to do with habits of conduct, which Arendt saw were much more important for citizens in a democracy than they are for citizens in another kind of polity. More responsibility rests on the individual citizen for the preservation of democracy than for other sorts of political arrangements.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, when you brought up the Godwin quote about how truth compels, and you said that Arendt says at one point truth carries coercive elements with it. It's also important to remember that she opens the essay Truth and Politics with a question, which is whether truth is impotent or not. And especially in politics, where we're dealing with factual truths and not rational truths. The question is whether truth has any power at all outside of force or persuasion. I'm not sure she thinks it does. Seyla, what do you make of this question of what do we do with truth? I mean, we keep talking about defactualization and the dangers of it, the dangers of lying in politics, and yet Arendt, as you well know, is suspicious of truth in politics. She says truth has no place in politics. She says truth may be impotent, factual truth. So what's when we talk about you, and you started with saying, the partisanship is not new, plurality is not new. It's unclear. There's so much worry about defactualization and lying. And part of it is that there doesn't seem to be much clarity at all about what it would mean to not have that. What would be the other side of that?
I think that there is a danger here of exaggerating the claims that she makes a little bit. And I'm looking at a page from an old edition of Truth in Politics, where she says, the chances of factual truth surviving the onslaught of power are very slim indeed, and it's always in danger of being maneuvered out of this world. And now we think there are varieties of factual truth as well, aren't there? I mean, she gives several examples, of factual truths. But let's take something about a scientific a factual truth. I think what we are going through is as a result of the very widespread skepticism also towards reason and rationality. There is also no longer any faith, let's say, in the protocols of science being able to establish something. I mean, and I don't want to talk about truth as if it were metaphysical reality, right? I mean, science establishes truth as a result, natural sciences, of it being reproducible by hundreds of people who engage in similar processes and experiments, right? And this is not the same thing as the truth of history, or as the truth of everyday events, which are a mixture of the two. So I'm not myself quite comfortable with truth with a capital T. I would much rather talk about truth also in terms of the different kinds of claims that we make in different knowledge fields, right? The truth that, in medicine needs to be proven differently than in. So this may sound a little bit like, philosophical hair splitting, but it is important because the kind of truth that she's talking about, that we are concerned with here, is also opinion about the affairs of the world. Right. I mean, for me, one of the best examples of what went wrong is take the case of Colin Powell in front of the United Nations with fallacious evidence about how Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction because there was some kind of yellow powder, etc., that demonstrated this or that. Here's one of the most honorable public servants, in my opinion, that this country has ever known. And here he was being forced to lie in front of the United Nations. Now, there was a truth there. And if we cannot agree that this was a lie, that Saddam Hussein did not possess weapons of mass destruction, even though he was a tyrant, okay, in many other ways, then this is the kind of question that Arendt says, I mean, if we can't agree on this, we lose our faith in the public sphere. And so I think in democratic politics, that no matter how much partisanship there is, we may disagree still about what to do concerning Saddam Hussein. That disagreement, maybe David and I have different opinions about this. That disagreement is fine, but we don't need to lie, or we don't need also to, go in front of the United Nations and lie to the world about this. And I think the same goes, and David mentioned this, for saying that the machines were, that the voting machines were compromised or were tampered with, or that there were undocumented migrants, who were voting. It's not as if this has never happened in American elections. It has happened in American elections that people have voted. Everybody talks about Mayor Daley in Chicago. It's not as, but it did not happen in the elections in Georgia in 2020, and that makes a difference. So I think that we need to talk about truth, at various levels, and also restore the confidence that we have, whether it is, I don't know if it is authority or if it is confidence in procedures that had a certain valence or on credibility. I mean, these are they bring out different questions also about theories of knowledge and so on. But yeah, so that's I'll stop there.
But it is one option for even I agree, Colin Powell is one of the more honorable public servants of this last generation, but it is an option for a person in that position to register what Arendt in a different essay, not in this book, but it's a relatively late and great essay called Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. It is possible to show non-support, which doesn't mean defecting necessarily from the country or even the administration quite that you are responsible to, but it means you will not lie on an important occasion. I mean, we saw that kind of conduct from one of the witnesses in the January 6th hearings, that young woman, Cassidy Hutchinson, who at the time didn't say, I want Trump to declare himself the loser, but did say what you're doing is wrong and tried to get people not to go along with it, and now has, indeed the people responsible for publicly announcing the tally in Georgia did too. Those Republican state legislatures showed non-support for Trump. That's possible to do. And Colin Powell is an interesting example of someone who saw all the weakness of the case he was making. He tells a story of going over the materials with his assistant, Lawrence Wilkerson, seeing most of it was crap and tossing out one thing after another and trying to hold on to what he could of the case that he was supposed to make in front of the United Nations. But there is a great responsibility for the, enacting of an exemplary character by public servants in a democracy, much more than in a more hierarchical regime. And we have seen just far too little of that in recent years, far too little of, people in a high position, let's say, in the cabinet of this or that administration, without showing ingratitude or rudeness or base conduct towards those to whom they owe their positions. Nevertheless, saying that they disagree and saying why. I think it goes back in American democratic matters a long way. Tocqueville observed something of this too. There's a greater pressure for conformity at the top and a greater pressure for conformity among neighbors in a democracy than there is in other sorts of society. But it's a real disservice when we have people who know the truth and won't say it. Right. And then it is later discovered that they knew it and didn't say it. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely agreed. I think that's an excellent point, and that's an Arendtian point, right? Isn't it? Civil courage. She's always looking for those for those moments, for those when somehow, as she puts it, the light breaks through. And even in the Eichmann book, there is the example of this young German soldier, Sergeant Schmidt, who just resists. And her phrase there is that it's as if at that moment, a light shone that broke through the darkness. We're talking about civic courage. Without that, yes, I agree. That's just completely, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there were a couple of examples in the Eichmann book. I mean, there's also the one example of one of the Jewish leaders who committed suicide rather than participate in sending people to camps based on lists. And this brings us to, for Arendt, this idea that thinking, and one of the ideas of thinking is to stop and question what other people, and she says thinking has no impact on the world usually, but the one time when thinking has an impact on the world is when everyone else is unthinkingly going along. The thinker simply stops, and her example for that is Socrates in the symposium, who just stops on the way to the symposium and stands there for hours thinking. And that even that act of not going along with others, as Cassidy Hutchinson was doing, as David suggested, is for her an act of civil courage, or at least personal integrity that stops the motion.
Yeah, I like the word integrity, not instead of courage, but as a kind of clarification of it, and making sure we don't estimate courage always as a dramatic and life-risking thing. It can be just non-support when you're making visible the fact that this is something you can't go along with. And, my mother's family, we knew people who in Germany at the time had refused to do the Hitler salute, this and that kind of. It wasn't always punishable by death or even prison, but very few people who had the thought came forward and were willing to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I don't want to start getting into the names, but there are differences. There are people who are actively calling out the lie of 2020. And there are people who are simply saying, we all know it's a lie, but we're not going to say anything about it. And it's just very different attitudes. I just want to bring up one other part of this essay, or these essays, before we turn to questions, which is near the end of the second essay, the longer essay, Truth and Politics. Arendt has a section where she says, well, look, truth is, there are no truths in politics, and politics is about opinion, and we need to hold on to facts, but it's hard. And some of these, and the nihilism and these questions we've been talking about. And she says, but one thing that maybe we learn is that politics, while it itself doesn't have a truth, it can't function without a realm outside of politics where truths can exist. And she gives a number of examples very quickly. Lawyers, law, journalists, scientists or academics. And she says that it's in these realms, which are supposed to be non-political, where we as a culture or a society or a civilization develop the kind of truths that then in politics we're supposed to hold on to and stand on and become the ground we walk on in the sky above us. And she's worried there about the politicization of the academy, the politicization of journalism, the politicization of the law. This is something that is very, in a sense, anachronistic in certain current debates. I'm wondering to what extent either of you believe, how important you believe that is our problem with defactualization and political truth maybe part of the politicization of these other realms that are now impacting politics from outside. If either one of you can take it, David, you want to start?
So I'll just give one example, and I take you to be bringing up the relationship between our attitude towards truth that ought to be acted on in society and the way that is taken hold of in politics. Consider as an example the COVID pandemic and the discovery and dissemination of the vaccines. Part of the skepticism or nihilism, if you like, about what seem by and large truthful claims stems from the arrogance, the lack of scientific humility by the expert class whom we rely on. So what we all know now, I think, can agree on as a fact, is that the vaccines help you stay out of the hospital, that the virus is much worse for older people than it is for very young people. And that nevertheless, there's a great deal that isn't yet known, and people can give others the virus even though they've been vaccinated, and they can catch it even though they've been vaccinated. All that is there. When you have an expert, one or two or three experts at the top of the field giving orders about national conduct on the vaccine, claiming that once you have the vaccine, it comes to a dead end in you, you can't give it to anyone else. And claiming at different times that masks help you or masks don't help you, 2 masks are better than 1, and so on. Saying more than they know in order to persuade people of their authority. A lot more epistemological or just public health humility on that score, I think would have, taken a great deal of the bad energy out of the vaccine skeptics, and you would have had a less contested scene in that area too. And that has to do with the social uses of authority and the way that's come to be understood in American society. So there's a real, there's a new chaotic element at work there too.
Seyla, did you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, I have watched this phenomenon of vaccine skepticism also in European countries, even in countries such as Germany and Italy, where there is a bit more confidence, and I think it's a more orderly public political system. And there were different kind of voices there. So I'm not sure if the question is also just a question of authority or they're linked. Let me just say something here. Maybe I'm in this respect, I may have a slight difference of opinion than both of you. I don't think that the critique of established paradigms in the historical and the human and social sciences, what is generally referred to as the critical theory of such, is objectionable. And I don't think that this is the crisis of the university. If there is a moment of truth, that is a moment of truth. If you want to analyze, the history of oppression, the history of exclusion, that is also a moment of truth. So I want to just say that I am not one who sort of accepts that, of course, critical thinking is also undermining authority and so on. No, critical thinking is itself in the service of truth, even though it can be taken to extreme. So Roger, what you talked about politicization, I don't want to just say, if excluded groups do not find themselves in the narratives we are telling and want to raise their voices in order to be included, that this is politicization. I'm not there. I'm not there. So there may be a disagreement about this. I think it's a matter of degree. I think it's a matter of how far this criticism goes, but I think political critique is also part of the process of truth seeking.
Well, I won't speak for David. I certainly don't think critical theory is or challenging assumptions is problematic in the academy or in journalism. I don't think that's what I was suggesting.
Okay.
I was simply suggesting that to the extent people in, whether it's in journalism or in academia or in law, people come to see themselves as activists or as advocates, the helpful and important constant questioning, which is part of what the pursuit of truth is doing, comes to be seen as politicized, and those fields become less able to articulate common truths, which have to change and have to constantly evolve under questioning, but questioning governed by certain institutional and hopefully intellectual norms, but maybe
Absolutely, and standards.
And standards. There are a lot of questions in the chat. David, can I go to those questions, or did you want to say something?
No, I have nothing to add.
So there's a couple of questions that I thought we would try and get to. We've got 12 minutes left. One is, I think, one that's on everyone's mind, and that's about technology, right? I think both of you have mentioned it at times. Obviously, when Arendt was writing, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have YouTube. And in some ways, what she was describing doesn't depend on those technologies. And yet, I think for many people, there's a sense that technology is, if not the cause of the problem, making it worse. So Lewis Altman writes, do you believe that modern technology makes lying more pernicious? The watching us that George Orwell so poignantly warned about in 1984, in the sense that tech makes political oversight more difficult to evade in the coming years. I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on technology and watching us and truth.
One thought that I had in addition to this observation, or in response to it, is this idea of generating artificial emotional reactions, because if you are on Facebook or other forms of media, you will click on it. The artificial solicitation of anger and outrage, right? I mean, this is part of rhetoric. It has existed before, but this is really quite outrageous and quite pernicious that websites do this in order to be able to augment the number of clicks something receives. And that really is, I don't know if this can be, if there can be policy that can be articulated about this, if this can in any way be controlled, but certainly this is a whole new domain.
Just a couple of obvious points that it's clear to me that the internet, the screens we all use, the medium-sized screens like this one, and iPhones and whatnot, create something new in manners, which Arendt wasn't around to see, and that is not only cutting down of people's habitual span of attention, just going from one thing to another to another to another, so you can't concentrate on examining your own feeling and evolving a thought from your examination of your feeling. But also, I think the habit of seeing and being seen, that is not necessarily friendly to what Arendt called judgment and what she called thinking. She stresses this in many different places. It's in the Eichmann book. It's in the very end of The Origins of Totalitarianism. That thought, that personal integrity is something that requires privacy. It requires solitude. The individuality that goes with intellectual conscience is not a matter of coming to be seen and seeing other people. And this very American and very democratic habit we've all required and seen, expand and explode to such a degree that I am made real by how public I am, by how many likes I get. I think that is, I'm saying the obvious. Hundreds of commentators have said it. nevertheless, I think it's true, and it is a large factor in what we've been calling here defactualization.
Yeah. I mean, the loss of the private where one can think for oneself. I mean, one sees that with, just for example, what happened in Los Angeles last week, where private conversations are taped and put out in the open. I mean, we can have our own opinions about what the results of that should be, but the assumption that you're alone in your home and able to have a private conversation anymore is fading away quickly.
Or even in what is in a conversation that has the format of a serious discussion, such as, for example, an academic seminar. And I don't want to exaggerate the changes in manners that have come about there, but it's been noticed again by many people that students at the level of college and university are more reserved and more cautious than they used to be. And it's very hard to argue against the assumption that governs that new piece of behavior. They're afraid they might be quoted and taken out of context. And yet we all know, we who have dealt with ideas, that, you know, to quote E.M. Forster, how do I know what I think till I see what I say? Hearing yourself say it is part of knowing what you think. And that has to happen in an environment where you feel, you know, your experimental thoughts, some of which may be very silly and rarely, but occasionally even worse than silly, that those won't be held against you as sort of a permanent scripture that you laid your hands on and said, this is what I believe.
There's a question from Aria Sherman. Can the distortions of truth in politics be traced to the distorted history of the American experience, de-emphasizing the annihilation of the native populations, the persistence of racial subjugation, and the demonization of our immigrant experience? Maybe the national identity we've created requires us to ignore the truth. So I take this to be, you know, maybe part of the defactualization is the fact that the truth we've been told for so long isn't a truth, and we're struggling with that. How do you guys, what are your thoughts on this question from Aria?
I don't think that the fable, the falsehood, the, you know, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and Black people were always treated better than we thought, and, you know, slavery, we got over it very fast. I don't think that was ever a happy story that many, even halfway educated people, were asked to believe. And the sources that would tell you otherwise have been available for a long time. So the idea that we've just now discovered that ours is a history full of stains, tarnishes, dents, bad faith, bad conduct, I don't think that's a recent discovery. It is true that the more naive you are, the more shocking you will find the bad facts about the history of the United States, which can be said of other countries too. But I don't think this is a sudden breakthrough against an old lie that millions and millions of people believed as to be the truth.
Seyla, do you want to add to that or not?
No, not at the moment. No.
Okay. We had about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna use one question that's here that I think is a great question to start us moving towards a conclusion, which is this. The question is from Diana Rosen in Los Angeles, and it's very simple. What makes you hopeful? She says, besides voting regularly and staying informed, what can the ordinary person do to contribute positively to discourse within their own communities? I think it's a great question. Seyla, do you want to take a crack at that?
There can be no politics without hope. And hope is not about optimism or pessimism. It's something that's very often misunderstood, and one thinks that that's a Pollyanna-ish statement. Rather, by hope, I mean what Arendt would call new beginnings. Okay? It's always possible to act differently. It's always possible to break somehow the chain of inevitability and for something new to emerge. If we don't think that that's possible, there is actually not only no politics, but our common life would become worse than even under totalitarianism, because even under totalitarianism, there were individual acts of resistance. Even in the camps, people produced art, people produced music. As crazy as an example as this, maybe it's important to remember. So in that sense, I think what Diana says is absolutely important. That is, we must not fall into either nihilism or this extreme skepticism, which is a form of nihilism. There is nothing to be done. What can I do? It's all lost anyway. And it's a form of believing in the nothing. That's what nihilism means. It means believing in the nothing. So in that sense, I think one other addition I would put, I don't want to sound too preachy here. And of course, one cannot do politics by oneself, right? I mean, politics is always acting with others. And however you do this, whether, you go, ballot watching, whether you go out on the streets, or whether you try to contribute something. So in that Arendtian sense, we always have to keep the possibility of the beginning in mind. And I certainly think this country is not at the point that new beginnings are not possible. I mean, it's at a critical point, it's at a turning point, but there is plenty of possibility to intervene constructively still, I believe.
Thank you very much. David?
I'll just say, if you scale it down from politics to society to just persons, I am made hopeful when I talk to some students that I meet here, young men or women, who, by whatever experience of what I'll call education, have been induced to think and are having the experience of changing their mind about something. And I don't mean that to do with one sort of political discovery or another. I think that as long as candid conversations can go on between almost strangers, between people you're interested in, and you discover, someone from a such and such a background thinking a thought you would never have guessed they'd have. I mean, that's always surprising, and the surprise of it gives me hope.
I think that's going to be a way to end, Max. I see you telling us so as well.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great place to wrap up, and just to say how grateful we all are for this, intelligent and passionate conversation about a huge subject, and how much you've given us to think about in the hour that we've had. You've been listening to Seyla Benhabib, Roger Berkowitz, and David Bromwich discuss Hannah Arendt's Lying in Politics, introduced by David Bromwich. I hope you'll join us for more online events from Library of America. On November 14th, it's The Unknown Kerouac. Is the All-American Jack Kerouac best understood as an immigrant writer? Join Kerouac editor Todd Teachin and Quebecois scholar Jean-Christophe Cloutier for a Kerouac centenary conversation about Kerouac's French-Canadian roots and their connections with his legendary masterpieces, with readings by actor Bill Heck. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about the Hannah Arendt and Kerouac volumes and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Professors Benhabib, Berkowitz, and Bromwich for a really terrific hour. And thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.